The river runs orange. Not at dawn, not at dusk. At all hours, without pause, without mercy, the Monongahela carries the color of a wound. It has carried it for decades. The men who work the banks have stopped noticing. They notice other things. The way the heat from stack number 4 presses against the chest like a living hand. The way molten iron at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit does not roar. It sighs, a low, planetary exhalation that vibrates the fillings in a man's back teeth. The way a casting floor, at full pour, smells of sulfur and scorched limestone and something older, something that has no name in any language spoken above ground. It is 1891. The furnace has been burning for 11 years without a single cold shutdown. 11 years of continuous combustion, continuous pressure, continuous human attendance. Inside the throat of stack number 4, a column of coke and iron ore and limestone 60 feet tall is being slowly consumed. Fed from above every 4 hours by crews working in staggered shifts around the clock, 365 days a year, without holiday, without exception. The output is approximately 400 tons of pig iron per day. The output is also, at irregular and unpredictable intervals, death. A tap rod fails. A skull, the hardened plug of cooled slag sealing the iron notch, cracks before the pour team is clear. What follows cannot be described in clinical terms. The men who survive describe it in other terms, quietly, years later, in the language of men who have decided not to think about a thing directly. Above their graves, for 100 miles northeast, a steel frame is rising above Manhattan at a rate of 1 floor per week. The iron had to come from somewhere. It came from here. Every civilization chooses what it will not look at directly. Rome looked away from its quarries. Britain looked away from its coal seams. And industrial America, ascendant, voracious, drunk on the vertical ambitions of its architects, looked away from the valley of the Monongahela, where the furnaces never cooled and the men who fed them aged in a currency measured not in years but in exposures. Here is the paradox at the center of this story. The same material that gave the modern city its spine, its height, its assertion of permanence against gravity. That material was produced under conditions of radical impermanence for the human body. Every beam hoisted above Manhattan. Every column sunk into Chicago bedrock. Purchased in a currency most Americans would never see paid. In a valley most would never visit. By men whose names appeared in no architectural record. The furnace gave the skyline its bones. The skyline never acknowledged the furnace. Between 1880 and 1900, the United States consumed more structural iron and steel than any nation in recorded history. The numbers are not metaphorical. They are architectural, civic, infrastructural, and they are staggering. In 1880, there were no steel-framed buildings above 6 stories anywhere on the continent. By 1895, Chicago alone had erected 43 structures above 10 floors. New York was moving faster. The Home Insurance Building, the Rookery, the Rand McNally. Each one demanded thousands of tons of refined pig iron converted into structural steel, delivered on schedule, priced to the fraction of a cent per hundredweight by men who had never stood within 100 miles of a blast furnace. The demand was not merely large. It was accelerating. Every new technique in foundation engineering unlocked a taller ambition. Every taller ambition unlocked a larger order. The orders flowed west and south, down rail lines into Pennsylvania, into Ohio, into the river valleys where the ore boats unloaded and the coke ovens burned and the furnace stacks rose above the treeline like the chimneys of a civilization that had decided industry was indistinguishable from destiny. Carnegie Steel alone was processing upward of 2,000 tons of iron per day across its Pittsburgh operations by the late 1880s. The Lucy furnace, the flagship stack, the record-setter, was the violent, irreplaceable heart of that output. When it ran, America built upward. When it failed, The consequences ran downward, through contracts, through payrolls, through bone. The Lucy furnace was not named for a goddess, though it behaved like one. It was named, with the unsentimental practicality of the industrial age, after the wife of Thomas Carnegie, Andrew's younger brother, the quieter partner, the man who managed while Andrew accumulated legend. The furnace was commissioned in 1870 at the Edgar Thomson Steel Works complex outside Pittsburgh, on a bend of the Monongahela where the river's geography made or delivery cheap, and the prevailing wind carried smoke away from the offices. It was not the first blast furnace in Pennsylvania. It was, however, the first to be engineered specifically for volume above all other considerations. Where earlier furnaces balanced output against maintenance intervals, the Lucy was designed around a single operational philosophy: continuous burn. No cold shutdowns. No scheduled dormancy. Feed the throat, tap the hearth, feed again. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Every hour the furnace ran cold was approximately 16 tons of lost output. Lost output was lost revenue. Lost revenue, in Andrew Carnegie's operational vocabulary, was a category of failure indistinguishable from moral weakness. By 1880, the Lucy held the world record for weekly iron output, 1,998 tons in a single 7-day period. The record was celebrated in trade journals. It was not celebrated on the casting floor. To understand what killed men at the Lucy, you must first understand what the Lucy was doing. A blast furnace is not, in the colloquial sense, a furnace at all. It is a reduction engine, a controlled chemical siege conducted at temperatures the human body cannot approach, cannot endure, and cannot meaningfully comprehend through sensation alone. The stack itself stands between 70 and 90 feet tall, a sealed shaft of firebrick and cast iron lined in materials selected specifically for their willingness to absorb punishment indefinitely. Into the top, charged in precise alternating layers, go coke, iron, ore, and limestone. Into the base, driven through water-cooled copper tuyères at pressures exceeding 12 pounds per square inch, goes the blast, superheated air, continuous, relentless, consuming. What descends through the shaft is not a fire. It is a transformation. The coke burns. The limestone flux reacts with silicate impurities in the ore, stripping them away. The reduced iron, liquid now, dense, at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, pools in the hearth at the base. Every 4 to 6 hours, the tap hole is opened. The iron runs. This moment, the tap, is when men died. Not from inattention, not from negligence. From proximity to a process operating at the precise boundary of what physical matter can withstand. There were 2 ways the Lucy could kill without warning. The first was the skull. During tapping, molten iron running through the notch would occasionally cool unevenly at the channel's edge, building a hardened crust of solidified metal, a skull. That partially obstructed the flow. When the obstruction released suddenly, the iron did not pour. It erupted. The pressure differential behind a blocked notch, in a furnace producing 400 tons per day, was sufficient to project liquid iron at velocities no man standing within 30 feet could survive. The second was the salamander. Over months of continuous operation, iron and slag seeped into the firebrick lining of the hearth and solidified into a massive accretion at the furnace base, sometimes exceeding 200 tons of embedded metal. A salamander distorted heat distribution unpredictably. It created internal pressure asymmetries invisible to any instrument then available. It meant the furnace was, in a structural sense, no longer the furnace its engineers had designed. It was something older, something with its own agenda. Neither condition announced itself. The men who worked the casting floor at the Lucy did not describe themselves as steelworkers. They were keepers. The word was operational, not ceremonial, but it carried, in the valley's particular vernacular, a weight that the trade journals never recorded. A keeper's shift ran 12 hours. 2 shifts, therefore, covered the day. There were no others. Sunday was not a rest day. The furnace did not acknowledge Sunday. A keeper earned between $1.40 and $1.75 per day in 1891, depending on seniority and the foreman's assessment of his reliability under pressure. He wore no protective equipment beyond a leather apron, and, if he was experienced enough to have learned caution, a heavy wool cap pulled low against radiant heat. There was no such thing as heat-resistant glassware for face protection. There was no mandated safe distance from the tap hole during a pour. There was distance a man chose for himself, balanced against the foreman's visible impatience and the production quota written in chalk on the shift board each morning. The burns were chronic. The lungs deteriorated from silica and coke dust on a timeline the company physicians, when consulted, attributed to personal constitution. Most keepers were dead or disabled before 50. Most were buried in the same county where they were born. It happened on a Tuesday in March at the 4 a.m. tap. The night shift had been running 11 hours. Stack number 4, the Lucy's sister furnace, operating on an identical continuous burn schedule, had been showing irregular pressure readings since midnight. The keeper on duty, a man named Deso Horvath, 31 years old, 17 months off the boat from eastern Hungary, had reported the anomaly to his foreman at 2 a.m. The foreman had noted it. The tap proceeded on schedule. The skull released at approximately 4:17 a.m. What followed occupied less than 4 seconds. The iron notch, obstructed by a hardened skull accretion estimated afterward at 60 pounds of solidified metal, gave way under accumulated hearth pressure before the poor team had completed its lateral clearance. The eruption was not vertical. It was angular, a pressurized fan of liquid iron at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit projecting outward across 40 feet of casting floor at a velocity later estimated, by the works engineer's post-incident report, at over 60 feet per second. 3 men were killed before they reached the floor. 2 others survived with injuries that ended their working lives. The furnace was back in operation within 18 hours. The company's internal incident report listed the cause as operator proximity error. There was no public inquiry. There was no coroner's inquest that named the furnace, the foreman, or the operational philosophy that had kept stack number 4 burning without inspection for 11 consecutive months. There was a company disbursement, a sum not recorded in any surviving ledger, paid quietly to the families of the 3 dead men, conditional upon the signing of documents whose language foreclosed further claim. Carnegie himself was in New York that week, negotiating rail freight rates. What the disaster did produce, invisibly and without acknowledgement, was pressure. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had been tracking incident rates across the Pittsburgh Valley for 3 years. The Lucy's 1891 event was added to a file that was growing faster than any official body was willing to read. 1 year later, at the Homestead Works 12 miles upstream, that accumulated pressure found its rupture point. Not through a failed skull plug, but through a lockout, a wage cut, and the arrival of 300 Pinkerton agents on armored barges at 4 a.m. In an hour that the casting floor men would have recognized intimately. The industry's capacity for violence was not confined to its furnaces. The Flatiron Building opened in 1902, the Singer Tower in 1908, the Woolworth in 1913, each one a vertical monument to the proposition that American cities could defy gravity, defy precedent, defy the inherited scale of the human world. None of their dedication plaques mentioned the Monongahela. The Lucy furnace was decommissioned in 1929, 59 years after its first lighting. By then it had produced iron sufficient to frame every significant steel-structured building erected in the United States between 1880 and 1910. It had also produced, in that same period, a casualty rate that its operators never published, a labor history that its owners spent considerable legal energy suppressing, and a generation of keepers whose bodies bore, in scar tissue and collapsed lung capacity, a precise material record of what the skyline actually cost. The river still runs orange in places where the old slag banks erode. The buildings still stand. The men who fed the fire that made them. Their names are nowhere on the steel.